All right. Good day, everybody. Let's get started. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jacob Ansari. We're here to talk about new PCI DSS requirements in version 4, specifically about e-commerce payments and web applications, user account management, and endpoint security. As a brief introduction, I've been a PCI QSA really since the beginning of PCI DSS, and having done some even predecessor payment card assessments prior to PCI DSS when the card brands ran their own standards many years ago. Okay, our agenda for today is pretty simple. We're going to touch on a brief overview of the new requirements in PCI DSS, how they're organized and structured. We're going to dive right into the selection of new requirements we're going to talk about today. We'll talk a little bit about strategies and solutions, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end. So please feel free to bring your questions, type them into the Q&A panel in the Zoom webinar, and I will happily address them when we get to that point. Let's get started. So there are a number of new PCI DSS requirements. I think there are about 55. Don't at me if you count 56. Most of which do not come into effect right away. The majority of the new requirements in version 4 of DSS come into effect. They sunrise after March 31st of the year 2025, and they are considered best practices until that point. So much so that your 4.0 report on compliance up until that point can and should say something like this is a best practice and not yet implemented or not yet required, and that's perfectly valid. A few of the new requirements, or relative few of the new requirements, come into effect right away with version 4 of PCI DSS. We did cover these in the first webinar we did in this series back in November, and we'll post a link to the slides and the video of that webinar in the chat. Okay, we're going to get started. I'm going to say that all of the text and images showing the requirements, text specifically, comes from the PCI DSS standard, which is available at this URL. Okay, let's talk about e-commerce websites. This is very possibly one of the most significant changes to version 4 of PCI DSS. And I say that both because the requirements are significant in how they change things, and because this set of requirements we're going to talk about first is one of the most broadly applicable changes. There are a number of requirements, many of which we talked about in our webinar in January about cryptography and cardholder data handling, that are very significant, but will very likely affect a smaller number of organizations overall. Right, so many organizations might look at those and say, "Ooh, boy, am I glad we don't have to deal with cryptographic hashes or anything like that." But for those entities that are affected, those requirements, may very well give them a bad day. This set of requirements is going to affect essentially everybody that handles e-commerce payments, merchants, including small merchants, because these requirements turn up in the self-assessment questionnaires, and the service providers that facilitate e-commerce payment processing. And so this first requirement we're going to talk about here focuses on the payment page, right? And let's be very clear, modern web technology for a long time has taken web content from potentially a number of sources and put it together in the page that really only exists as a single composite thing in the user's browser. And so it may be that what the web server serves up is only a piece of it, and some other third-party components, come together under the model for modern kind of web browsing in the browser of the consumer. And payment pages often work like this too. A number of e-commerce setups for a long time have used things like redirections or iframes or other scripting techniques to facilitate essentially the third party, the somebody other than the merchant, loading the payment acceptance method in the user's browser and collecting the payment details. And there was a brief period of time where merchants seemed to think that they were no longer in scope for PCI DSS. I hope we've mostly disabused everybody of that notion. But those kinds of payment pages are relevant to these requirements. So even if you're the e-commerce merchant who outsources to a third-party payment acceptance entity, this set of requirements applies to you as well, to the things that you serve to the user's browser. And we're talking about, again, that payment page and the scripts and active content that are part of that. So if we look at this requirement 643, it says all of the payment pages scripts that are loaded and executed in the consumer's browser are managed, right? Which is to say that they are authorized, that the integrity is assured, and that there is an inventory of the scripts, right? So this is intended to prevent the kinds of e-commerce skimming attacks that have become substantial over the last several years, and mitigate against either the consumer's browser loading something hostile, having a legitimate piece of content subverted or changed by an attacker, and that the merchant, right, the entity providing this to the consumer, knows what scripts are supposed to be there and which are not, and so they can spot the entities that don't belong, right? So the inventory of scripts is intended for both in-house or kind of third-party content that gets loaded on the payment page. And there are a number of technical controls that are potentially useful here. Some of these are endemic to kind of modern web technology, and you may have heard of them, like SRI or CSP, right? So sub-resource integrity, or SRI, is the idea that the component that loads into the user's browser has an integrity check, essentially a cryptographic checksum, kind of like a file integrity monitoring tool, but obviously not for a file, but for a piece of web content. And then CSP is the idea that the browser then only loads content from authorized sources. So these are definitely not like complete turnkey solutions for resolving this, and I don't want to convey the idea that they might, but these are the kinds of building blocks that an organization might use in order to facilitate these requirements, where we say, here is how we confirm that scripts are authorized, potentially using CSP, right? Or assure the integrity of each of those components, possibly using SRI. And then an inventory is probably going to use, more conventional inventory methods, but you get the idea. And so the whole point of this is to prevent e-commerce scraping attacks, many of which kind of operate under the sort of amorphous label that you might have heard of called MageCart. And MageCart isn't really even a specific individual or group or piece of malware, but a whole kind of category of threat actor that subvert e-commerce payment pages to scrape the payment data, often in a wholly transparent manner to all of the other parties, right? So the user makes a payment, gets charged for the thing, and then receives their purchase. The merchant receives the payment for the good or the service or the whatever that they have provided, and the payment processing entity appears to have facilitated a transaction and taken their piece of it. And so everybody looks like they got what they were intended to get, and all seems right with the world. But along the way, the attacker has scraped up the payment card data and then can facilitate their own fraudulent attacks down the line. And there are a number of famous examples of this kind of attack being perpetuated, because this is now, with the rise of chip cards, the preeminent way that card fraud transpires, right? Card present fraud has largely crashed, but e-commerce skimming is where most of the card fraud happens anymore. So think about implementing these controls with the idea to how do we stop MageCart and its ilk of attack, because that's what this is intended to do. And so I want to point out a piece about the inventory requirements, which I've highlighted here in the third bullet on 643, right, where it says the inventory of all scripts is maintained with a written justification as to why each is necessary. And then if you go to the next page of the PCI DSS in the guidance column, where it defines necessary, right, necessary is needed for the functionality of the payment page to accept a transaction. And that's a very specific statement. And so what's necessary is making the payment happen, right? And not things like marketing analytics or transaction conversion trackers or chatbots or other things like that. Those may be appropriate on the page before the payment page, right? Or after the payment page, but the payment page itself is intended to just be the thing that facilitates the payment. So based on this definition, not only will a number of organizations have to figure out how to implement the controls to facilitate 643, but may also have to re-architect some of their e-commerce payment functionality to eliminate what will be considered unnecessary scripts from the payment page itself. And so this is one of the reasons why I think these e-commerce payment acceptance requirements that are new in version 4 of PCI DSS are potentially the most significant changes and have potentially some of the biggest lift for a variety of organizations. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about detection, right? So requirement 643 that we had on the last screen is a preventative control. It is intended to say, have these controls to prevent hostile content from being loaded or prevent an attacker from subverting the integrity of a particular piece of scripting or what have you, right? 11.6, and so I'm jumping around the DSS a little bit here, is the mirror of that, but it is the detective control. And so this is saying here a change in tamper detection mechanism is deployed to alert personnel to unauthorized modification or hostile or unwanted scripts. And it's intended to look at both the HTTP headers and the content of the payment page, right? And this is to detect the things, again, that are received by the consumer's browser, right? Which is a little bit of a different focus than how we think of conventional integrity detection or unauthorized actions, right? So it's not just about, has somebody deployed a hostile component in the merchant's environment or in the service provider's environment or something like that, but have they deployed a hostile component that the user's browser is rendering and the user regards as legitimate. So you have to kind of shift your focus a little bit from how we conventionally think about applying PCI DSS controls. And so this is intended to occur at least once every 7 days or on a period determined by your organization's targeted risk analysis. We've talked about targeted risk analyses or TRAs in prior webinars. I'd encourage you to go back and give that a listen again, or please send me a message afterwards or ask about it in the Q&A session at the end of this, and we'll talk about TRAs and how they might be applicable here. But the idea is you determine the periodicity of your review based on your risk analysis. So a few other points. Again, this is the guidance section from that set of requirements in the PCI DSS, and I've chopped it off as a specific image here because the thing turns into an eye chart very quickly. But this is not intended to install a piece of software on the user's browser, right? A user doesn't need to download some new protection mechanism to run in their browser or on their PC or on their mobile device or what have you in order to use your e-commerce site. This is to look at the kinds of technical controls that are described in the examples here, like using CSP, right? Or monitoring what kinds of third-party JavaScript is getting loaded into the browser, or looking at other kind of tamper detection mechanisms, or using some of the content delivery systems that are endemic to a big chunk of modern web components to look for hostile content and mitigate against that being loaded in the browser. It is very likely for many organizations that they will need the services of a third party to help facilitate this. I think particularly small or mid-sized e-commerce entities or organizations for whom their e-commerce channel is small or mid-sized relative to the overall size of their business may want to look for a third-party service provider to help them facilitate some of the stuff in 643 and 11.6. I should say now that if you seek out the services of such a service provider, your probably first question should be, are you PCI DSS compliant? Because that third-party service provider will almost assuredly connect to and 100% impact the security of the payment environment, and so should be part of the scope of your PCI DSS, which means they should probably get their own PCI DSS assessment, and that would be how you have some assurance that they're holding up their end of the bargain. But it's important to think about the extent of what this will do to your organization, how you think about e-commerce, and what kinds of controls you need to build in order to meet these requirements. And so when you think about how to get started, I think the first place to go is the kind of inventory aspect of this, right? Where are your payment pages? And do you understand how they are assembled in the consumer browser? Where does all of the content come from? What is it for? Again, you're going to want to evaluate which are necessary to facilitate the payment and which are not, and where you're going to move those, or how you're going to deal with those and achieve, the same functionality that you intend to achieve, but by moving them out of the payment page. And then you want to think about where the existing sort of technologies and procedures are going to be useful to detect and prevent unauthorized code from executing in the payment pages. So we've talked about CSP and SRI, and those are valid options. But again, I want to emphasize that those will not be turnkey solutions. If you're looking at CSP, you still need to have a clear set of known source entities that can provide the content to load in the payment page. Or if you're using SRI to check for integrity, you're still going to need to implement the engineering, right? The tooling and the procedural elements to say what are the valid SRI hashes for the content that is getting loaded. And then if those don't match with the known good values that we expect, what happens? How do we respond to that? And some changes in CSP or SRI are benign. So it's possible to then create a whole blizzard of what amount to false positives, right? Saying, oh, this thing has changed, but it's not actually a harmful change. And then kind of get snowblind to the potential attack that is lurking in the midst of that. So I don't think we can overstate the significance of these requirements, or potentially how complex they're going to be to implement for a lot of organizations. And so you have the time now to think very carefully about how it's going to impact your organization and your e-commerce functionality. And you have the time now to start researching potential solutions and looking at third parties, or if you're going to go down the road of building your own tool set for this, what that is going to take. And I cannot stress enough that now is the time to start that, because this is a big task and there's no getting around that. Okay, so let's look at other kinds of web applications or software content in version 4 of PCI DSS. So for a long time, requirement 6 has talked about applications as the nomenclature for where things like software development lifecycles are applicable. And that language has changed here starting in requirement 632, where that is now changed to bespoke and custom software. And that's a mouthful, and we're all going to get sort of tired of saying the words bespoke and custom software over and over again. But it was intended, in part at least, to guard against either mistaken or sort of bad faith efforts to end run the need for some of these controls in requirement 6, because the organization would say things like, oh, we don't develop applications. These are microservices, or we don't do any application development. This is just some scripting to glue some things together, or this is a serverless component, or, whatever nomenclature was relevant to the techniques that they were using, even if it didn't contain the word application any longer. And so the idea here is that if you are developing software, if you have developers, if you have engineering folks, or frankly, even people that are doing that job, if that is not in their job title, you need to contend with these requirements, because that is where application security or those kinds of software security vulnerabilities in either the code or the process or the build and deployment elements can come into play and adversely affect the security of your organization. So step 1 here in requirement 632 is to make an inventory of that bespoke and I can't even say it anymore. Bespoke and custom software, as well as any of the third-party components incorporated into that bespoke and custom software, and keep that up to date, because that is intended to then inform your requirement for addressing vulnerabilities and applying security patches, which has now moved to requirement 633. So if you think about famous software supply chain attacks like Log4j, where suddenly everybody on the internet had to scramble to say, do we even run this component, and find it in a variety of unlikely places, like, oh, it's in this user agent that we didn't think of and not on the web servers, where when we told everybody, oh, we don't run Log4j, we're fine, right? But there it was lurking underneath something all along, right? The goal is to say, now we have an accurate inventory that we take pains to keep updated, so that when the next internet melting security vulnerability in some previously unheard of web component comes to light, you can easily determine its effect. And you've probably already taken pains to do the software updates for that along the way, and don't have to scramble to avoid getting hosed by the next major attack. And so we'll look at 6.4 here, which is very, very similar to requirement 6.6 in PCI DSS 3.2.1. This is the requirement that was intended to provide some application security assessment in between your annual penetration testing intervals, right? The idea being that most sort of conventional vulnerability scans don't find a lot of application security vulnerabilities, and pen tests are expensive and time consuming. So let's find some middle ground. And how 6.6 was worded was to say, either get an automated technical solution, a web application firewall or something like that, or do an ongoing application assessment using like some sort of review with either pen testing or forensic or application security assessment techniques at least every 12 months. And version 3 of PCI DSS says after any change, and you can sort of spot the bad faith attempts when you see somebody's report on compliance saying after significant changes, which is not technically what that requirement entails. But here in version 4 of PCI DSS, this requirement now says after significant changes. So they've sort of exceeded to the reality that doing after every change is at least not happening in many cases. But otherwise, this requirement it's presently constituted is very much like requirement 6.6, but that review option is going away. And so you can see here in the applicability notes in the box kind of under on the left-hand side that this requirement will be superseded by 6.4.2 after March 31st of 2025, right? When it looks like this, right? When it looks like the other option. So now public-facing web applications will need an automated technical solution, and that application security review process ceases to become a viable option. And so this may be a conventional on-premise kind of WAF, or something like mod security, or a cloud-based solution, or something maybe that is CDN provides as a service. There are a lot of potential options for how that technology might manifest itself. But look at the part where it says it's configured to either block the attack or to generate an alert that is responded to. And what you need to regard as an essential component to that is that the rules that it uses to block or alert on potential attacks are tuned to your specific organization. I know several of my colleagues and I over the years have found situations where the organization has installed something like mod security, which is a piece of free software and a perfectly viable option as an automated technical solution, but then have only used the stock rules that come with that open source project and not incorporated any more rules or done any rules tuning themselves or written any additional filters to look for the attacks that are specific to their organization. And the truth is that it doesn't really do very much out of the box. It needs to be tuned and regularly maintained to have any chance of being effective at stopping those kinds of attacks. So you should plan on essentially that total cost of ownership of the care and feeding of your automated technical solution to make sure that it's actually doing something for you. And even if you're outsourcing that to a third party who posits that they are maintaining the rule set and tuning that based on their threat intelligence, you want some assurance that they're doing so with regularity. Okay, let's move into user account elements. Requirement 7 has for a long time been this sort of tiny little requirement in the DSS that's forgotten and largely unloved. And so it's trying to assert itself here in version 4 with a new requirement in 724 that says that all the user accounts, which is to say for everything that's in scope, and their related access privileges, get a semi-annual user account review. And this is to say, not just should that user account exist, right? Has this person left the organization or not? But are the privileges that that user account has appropriate? And so if you determine, no, this user account has too many privileges, it doesn't need this privileged access or this administrator group membership or something like that, then this is the opportunity to shake those things loose, identify the problems, correct them, and then have some management acknowledgement of the course of action that has transpired. So this may supplement things like user offboarding processes, but it's not intended to replace that. So you can't say, oh, we don't need to do a semi-annual user account review because we make sure we offboard users when they leave the organization. That's not actually quite the point, although they're somewhat parallel to each other. So this is potentially, if you have a number of different kinds of systems and a number of different kinds of authentication repositories, this could get very extensive to have to evaluate all of those users at least twice a year and say, should this user account exist and does it have the right privileges? And then 725 is acknowledging a reality that has been the case for a long time, but it hasn't really been sort of specifically addressed in the DSS directly. This is to provide some provisions for what PCI DSS is calling application and system accounts. These are the kinds of things that some others have called service accounts for a long time. These are accounts that are not associated directly with an individual user, a human being, but instead are associated with an application or a system or a process. They are not intended to be used by people. And so here, these requirements are intended to make sure that those accounts are based on least privilege, and that they are limited to only the systems for which they are required. So I think we've all, at least heard the sort of horror stories of the systems where an application or a database or something like that required a user account with membership in like an administrator or other privileged group, and very typically had some weak password or some other terrifying control. And as the assessor, we come along and we say, that's not great. Like, can we fix that? And then, every application owner and database administrator crawls out of the woodwork to say, no, we can't do that. If we change this, if we take its privileges away, then all of these things will break and our whole edifice comes crashing down. And clearly nobody wants to do that. But this requirement is intended to say that those user accounts should not be compelled to require that kind of privilege, right? Those applications, those systems that ride on top of this functionality need to be designed to use a lesser amount of privilege. And so that's the intention of this, is to find those user accounts, configure them with the least amount of privilege, and make sure that they are only accessible by those systems or processes that require their use. And then this requirement, 7251, right? Because now we have requirements with 4 digits in the numbering, is intended to do that sort of user account review process that we looked at in 724, but for these kinds of application or system accounts. Now, unlike the user-facing kind of user account reviews that are required to be every 6 months, this is set at a period determined by your targeted risk analysis. And otherwise is similar to 724, right? Discover if those accounts need to exist, if they have the correct privileges, fix any mistakes or inaccuracies or things that are no longer needed. And then there's a management acknowledgement that the access remains appropriate or has been corrected to an appropriate state. So there are now two sets of user account reviews, right? One for human users and one for system service application accounts, that need to be conducted as part of a regular requirement 7 effort. Okay. Moving into requirement 8, let's talk a little bit about passwords, which everybody loves, especially password composition requirements. We've talked about multi-factor authentication in the last webinar, and so I'm not going to rehash that here. But passwords, their minimum length has increased from the venerable 7 characters to now 12 characters. To increase their complexity, right? The composition requirements for both alphabetic and numeric characters have remained the same. And what I'll say about passwords is that so the composition requirements have changed from 7 to 12. Password age requirements have a sort of different shift to them, right? If the password is the only authenticating factor, which is to say, if there's no multi-factor authentication for authenticating to that particular system, then the password must expire every 90 days, which everybody hates. But the idea is to prevent that password from being compromised by password cracking or similar attacks. If you don't want to expire them every 90 days, then if the security posture of that account is dynamically analyzed, which is to say that there's some analysis that looks at where the device is coming from, or the time of authentication, or other criteria about the usage that could give indicators of suspicious use or valid use. And from this, we should point to the NIST Zero Trust Architecture Special Publication 800-27. That can be an effective surrogate for the password age limitation, to say that instead of aging them out every 90 days, we do these other dynamic analysis elements to confirm that they are not being misused. That's the goal of this in terms of password compositions. Or, implement multi-factor authentication even for non-remote access and make that go away. Okay, briefly to come back to application or system accounts, here in 8.6, if those application or system accounts or the service accounts are capable of being used interactively, which is to say that somebody could sit down at the console and key in the username and the password, and then it will actually log that person in as that application or service account, they need to meet these requirements, right? That can only be permitted under exceptional circumstances for a limited time with an appropriate business justification, and that use is explicitly authorized, the identity is confirmed, and the activities are tracked while that use occurs. So if you have an application account that's powering, how an application communicates with a database, and there's a troubleshooting situation, right, or an exceptional condition where the DBA has to log in as that user to effectuate some change, that can be permitted, but that needs to be justified. That needs to be specifically authorized. It needs to be time limited. It needs to be monitored. That identity needs to be confirmed before the person does the change. And really, the intent is that otherwise, those user accounts are prohibited from interactive login when not expressly authorized. And that means that the user account is specifically configured to preclude that, not merely just that people don't generally know the password to that account. Okay, moving on to some more pieces about application or system accounts. Here in 8.6.2, the idea is that the passwords or passphrases or other credentials used for those application or service accounts are not hard-coded or otherwise sort of insecurely stored in scripts or configuration files or source code or other things like that. this has the potential to be kind of a sleeper in terms of its disruptive quality to a number of organizations where applications are built on service accounts where the password is stored in a configuration file or a script or hard-coded into the application source code or something like that. This may be legacy systems, I think, will be particularly impacted by this, but I think even new systems that are designed with this sort of particular anti-pattern are going to have to face needing some re-architecture to move those credentials out of configuration files or the like, and then moved into something like a secret management platform or a KMS or something similar to that, where they can make a function call to the secret management platform to receive the credential. And so if you're not careful, and if you have a number of systems that were configured otherwise, this could be an enormous amount of work to carefully re-engineer the process and test all of the functionality and make sure that it works the way you expect, such that this doesn't cause a cascading series of errors when you try to meet this requirement. So again, this is the place where starting soon to identify all of those situations and start thinking about what the solutions might be for your organization is of paramount importance. Okay, so moving into endpoints, we are jumping back and forth both directions in the PCI DSS in terms of its requirement layout. In requirement 5, now the frequency of anti-malware activities is determined by your targeted risk analysis. So instead of making sure that scans are run on a fixed period specified in the requirement, it's now intended to be based on your targeted risk analysis. Now, there's a somewhat famous piece of language in version 3.2.1 of PCI DSS where it talks about anti-malware software being deployed on systems, quote, not commonly affected by malicious software. A number of people have taken that as an elaborate proxy for Microsoft Windows systems. And there are various reasons for that and various ways to sort of consider that. I think it's fair to say that the set of system components that are not commonly affected by malicious software has grown beyond merely Windows systems, even in the last couple of years, if not over the last decade or more. But now the language has changed, and it specifically reads system components not at risk for malware, which is subtle, but very significantly different, because very few systems are not at risk for malware, even if they are perhaps not commonly affected by malicious software. And so when you think about evaluating periodic risk, right, which was the requirement to say for systems not commonly affected, do some periodic analysis to see if maybe they are affected. Now that language is do some periodic assessment to say, are these systems that we think don't need anti-malware software, are they not at risk for malware? And if they are at risk for malware, then requirement 5 controls should apply. And then also the frequency of that is determined by your targeted risk analysis, as well as things like how often you run the anti-malware scans, or how often you now scan removable media, which is now an expressly stated requirement in requirement 5. Okay, the last kind of new requirement I want to talk about in some detail here is about phishing protection. And this, again, sort of like some of the consumer browser requirements, takes a little bit of some different thinking in terms of how you evaluate where the risks are. So the requirement says that there are processes and automated mechanisms to detect and protect personnel against phishing attacks, right? And phishing is largely an email-based attack vector. And so you may say to yourself, well, my email server is not in scope for my PCI DSS environment. I've taken pains to segment it. I've made sure it's isolated away. They can't connect to each other. Woohoo, I don't have to deal with this requirement. Not so, right? If we read the text carefully, it says the mechanisms are in place to detect and protect personnel against phishing attacks, right? So this does not necessarily mean that your email server is in scope for PCI DSS for all of the other requirements. And this is not a surrogate for other things like anti-phishing training and security awareness training or things like that, which you should still continue to do. But this is to say that the users who have access to the in-scope system components need protection against phishing attacks. And again, this is potentially another sleeper kind of requirement in terms of its significance, because very nearly everybody has users who remotely access or who access the in-scope components, right? I don't think there are too many shops out there with no human intervention, right? They just kind of run autonomously, although maybe GPT-4 is going to change that. But everybody has users who access their in-scope environment, and all of those users, almost assuredly, many of those users have email addresses. And so the goal is to protect those users from phishing attacks using some sort of automated anti-phishing solution. Now, this may be something that happens at your sort of mail gateway level, like an email protection service, like a Mimecast or something like that, where there's server-side malware checking or link scrubbing, or authenticity verification by looking at the sender's DMARC policy. DMARC is a series of kind of email controls that are intended to say that the server or the sender of the mail that the mail server is looking at, the sending domain is who it claims it is and isn't necessarily an attacker masquerading as that sender, right? So there are a couple of ways to do this. This could be, again, handled by a third party. This could be done with some internal sets of tools. Maybe even there are some tools if you're using like a cloud-based mail services provider, like an Office 365 or a Google Apps. Maybe there are some controls that you can employ that are provided by those parties to help with some anti-phishing components. But the goal is to say we have some technical controls that are automated to detect and protect against phishing attacks for the personnel who access the in-scope environment. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some strategies for implementation. Again, those new web application requirements will affect very nearly everybody who has any e-commerce, including small merchants who complete the self-assessment questionnaire. And these have significant engineering changes, right? And process changes, right? I don't want to discount that. So it's imperative for those organizations to start their planning now and to start looking